The next two talks on investigating glaucoma were originally done as one PowerPoint, but it was a biggie. So I decided to split it. This is 2.1, where I'm specifically dealing with tonometry and CCT because it is quite a big subject. But in this opening PowerPoint, I'll also do an introduction to overview to both talks. And I'll recap them in the beginning of the next one as well anyway. Before I start this section, I want to make this following statement. I think we should question things. I plagiarize this from the Buddha. Question everything, find your own truth. And I will be posing some questions about what we do. And I think we all should. You don't have to agree with them. But I do think it's important that we don't just follow mantras that are given to us. We've got to consider what we're actually doing. So in these two parts, I want to basically review initially the traditional investigative techniques that we use for glaucoma, the usual triumvirate, and introduce the newer investigative techniques that really rather enhance those three. But importantly, I then want to consider in the next talk what I call the anatomical sieve that allows us to systematically and thoroughly investigate glaucoma as IP optometrists, not just latch-on pressure, latch-on disc, latch-on fields. And at the end, I'll also go through procedures for gonioscopy and its grading. But today I want to stick to just tonometry and CCT, the types and the theory. And also importantly, the statistical techniques that we use to compare machines and instruments and how to critically appraise literature. Because I think a lot of this stuff is published, we read it, we don't necessarily critically appraise it, and we accept the results. And I want to use some examples of tonometry to show you how I think we have to be far more critical of what we're reading. So in the 20th century, we had our three. We had IOP, we had our optic nerve assessment, usually with an ophthalmoscope, and we had some sort of field test, and earlier on very rudimentary, I would say. So the IOP is a risk factor. The optic nerve assessment is important from a clinician's point of view because we're looking at the structural damage done. Fields are really important from a patient's point of view actually because it's the functional impact. Now into the 21st century, obviously we've improved those three. We now incorporate pachymetry into our IOP measurement, and this is actually really important. And I'm going to suggest, and I hope I'm going to prove to you, that CCT, corneal thickness measurements, are really a surrogate measure of corneal biomechanics, because we can't measure true corneal biomechanics without excising the cornea, so CCT becomes pretty much our best alternative. And now, of course, we've got stereoscopic Volk examinations, we've got CLOs, we've got OCTs, and certainly it makes looking at the optic nerve just so much easier. I don't know how people use ophthalmoscopes. And for fields now, we've also got OCTs and SLOs and so on that can plot somewhat objectively what we expect to find with the fields. Now that's still maintains, that's the three, isn't it? But as independent prescribing optometrists, I want to suggest to you that if we're investigating glaucoma, we must not stick to that. We've got to be thorough and we've got to have a systematic technique for investigating an extremely complex disease process. You don't want to just do fields, do pressures, look at the optic nerve and refer. So, you know, we need a thorough case history, we need tonometry, we need pachymetry, we need some form of angle assessment, and then looking at the anterior chamber for secondary glaucomas. Then finally we go to the optic nerve, and then finally we do fields. And fields obviously have to be the final thing in my opinion, because the choice of technique that you're going to do for fields has to reflect all the other stuff. It should never be a pre-test, obviously. But we have to stop thinking IOP, discs, fields, in my opinion. So tonometry. What on earth can you say about tonometry? This section's quite long actually because I did my doctorate on this. It was called Tonometry, a Study in Biomechanical Modelling. And I have what I consider quite important, valid points about some of the things that are being presented to us these days. But certainly we can all agree that IOP measurements have long been recognised as having limited diagnostic value in isolation. And I think that's an important point, in isolation. No good combination of sensitivity and specificity at any cutoff points ever been demonstrated. And of course, further that, what about the accuracy and repeatability? If it's very variable, if its accuracy, well, not accuracy, if its repeatability is variable, then you can't be sure where in that range of variability you've taken the measurement anyway. However, IOP is still a key part of the diagnostic process. We have to have a baseline. Since treatment is aimed at reducing IOP, we need to have some baseline on which to say, yes, we've achieved a reduction or we haven't. And we may choose it depending on the disease severity at first diagnosis. But we know from that Medscape thing that, you know, the spread of field loss and IOP is huge. There's that little blue area ranging from something like, I don't know, about 15 mils up to obviously over 30, which shows glaucomatous field loss. But it's in amongst that olive area where there's no glaucoma at all. So we're trying to pick that tiny little blue area out of that huge area of noise of normal patients. So tonometry is pretty dodgy. So I want to introduce these concepts, validity, repeatability, and utility. Validity is accuracy. How accurate is the machine in measuring the real value, the intracameral IOP? Repeatability, how consistent are those repeat measures? And then this concept of utility asks the question, is the information actually of help? Now, does the number matter? No, it absolutely does not. Mills says, you know, an absolute measure of IOP is not usually important, rather a comparison to a standard baseline. And this was a concept even introduced by Maklikov in 1885. If a gap measure could be relied upon to represent a standardized measure designated IOP, that we designate IOP, you know, it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3 mils or 2 or 3 mils below or above, so long as it's repeatable and reproducible, then nothing else actually is required. And indeed, that's one of the greatest arguments for maintaining GAT as a reference. These authors say, regardless of technological improvements, since virtually all literature and clinical trials were based on GAT, you know, this is going on 70 toward 80 years, redefining standard would necessitate redefining statistical norms and targets, which would be an absolute nightmare. Does the number, repeatability matter? Absolutely. If a tonometer can't agree with itself, it's not likely to agree with anything else. And regardless of how accurate an innovative new machine may be, it will not show agreement with the reference if the reference machine shows poor repeatability. So the number is really important, or the repeatability of that number. And then utility, is it important? Brandt says, IOP collection is flawed. Clinicians assess a complex and highly variable pathological process based on IOP snapshots. So a 10-second snapshot of IOP in a clinic room during clinic times every 6 months, say. Is that important? How does that help us? Well, there's new technology out there. Triggerfish, and there's is a contact lens with a sensor in it, and it records 24-hour variation that is due to IOP. Now, these two authors, this came from Switzerland. There's actually there's a Professor Elsheik at Liverpool Uni who's coming up with more as well. But these two authors say the future of glaucoma diagnosis and management will require an entire paradigm shift. They suggest, how are we going to ever assimilate the ensuing data avalanche, and how do we cope with the educational challenges that this will pose clinicians? This is a serious question. This technology is out there, but how on earth are we going to assimilate it when we're so used to 80 years of single readings. So is the Goldman the gold standard? I mean, first of all, I ask you, has anyone actually ever looked inside one? You know, this is the 21st century. And if you look inside one of those things, it's pretty primitive. And despite expert opinions saying it's still the best, and meta-analysis coming up with, because there's no contra evidence, but there are some very, very famous people out there who do not think it's the best thing. Whittaker and Steen back in 1993. The premise of tonometry is the so-called Imbert-Fick law, not a law at all, but an explanation of tonometry where none of the assumptions are true. The Imbert-Fick construct was not the foundation on which tonometry was developed, but was an attempt to explain the technique post-construction. Now, I'm not sure I totally agree with that second section, having read all of the papers right back for the very first ones, Imbert and Fick. However, it does suggest that there's questions out there. It's not all clear cut. Back in 1960, after Goldman had just come out, GATT had just come out, this so-called law was not introduced by an expert physicist or mathematician. I think that's important to think, but by an ophthalmologist who invented a tonometer and looked for a logical foundation to support the instrument. In my opinion, these theoretical speculations are quite erroneous. And again, I agree with that actually. But this contemporary chap from the University of Dresden, I suspect almost no one critically read the papers of Goldman and Schmidt, which contained the limitations of the method outlined by the authors. Today, the basic biophysical and statistical details are forgotten, and applanation tonometry is used with the same assurance as a ruler to measure length. Wow. And then it gets really nasty now. Why are we worshipping applanation tonometry like a golden calf? The reason is a historical one. Hans Goldman was very famous. And it's true, if you're very famous, your kudos is high, you get things going quickly. And Brandt, in 2004, our ability to accurately measure IOP far weaker than imagined. We rely on a flawed measure on which to base clinical decisions. So all these things are very important. And indeed, Goldman and Schmidt themselves, in their first paper, second paper in 57, they admit the use of coarse methods to model the eye and suggest their conclusions may represent first approximations. So that's their comment 60 years ago. But it turned out to be not the first approximation, it turned out to be the only approximation. So when we're comparing instruments, we used to always use correlation coefficients, but they're not useful for comparing tonometers. Readings can be well correlated, but still not show any agreement. So the only correlation slope that also gives agreement is if it's at 45 degrees and is a straight line. Then you know that when one machine measures 15 millimeters of mercury, the other machine measures 15 millimeters of mercury. But that's a rare situation. That line correlates, but it certainly doesn't agree, except at one point. And indeed, you can have negative correlation. So they're all correlations, and they'll have very good correlation coefficients. You know, they'll be 0.92, 0.98 if they're a perfect straight line, which you wouldn't get anyway. But but that doesn't mean they agree. So the correlation coefficient's out the door. And in 1986, that's when Bland and Altman came up with this revolutionary thing. And their original paper was printed in the Lancet, so it was a pretty important paper. But what they said was, their premise is, and this is important because this technique, I think, gets misinterpreted at times. So what they're saying is the reason they came up with this is they said neither instrument can be assumed without error. The only anchor and the best estimate of true reading is the mean of the two measures. It would be a mistake to plot the difference against either value separately, because the difference is related to both. So relating, it means that if you assume one machine's perfect, then all the error is attributable falsely to the other instrument. And this is obviously a statistical fallacy. So they came up with this nifty way of doing it, but their goal, well, I'll come on to the next slide. So Bland and Altman specify the rationale, the reason for coming up with this statistical technique. And as they say, many medical assessments for practical necessity rely on indirect techniques to estimate the real measure. The true value remains unknown. The true value was unknown before you compared the two instruments. The true value is unknown after you compare the two instruments. So the goal is a much more modest one, although one could argue much more important, than simply trying to compare to a gold standard. It simply reflects the pragmatic assessment of whether one instrument can replace another without compromising clinical management. And that's the important point. And it's not the same as comparing to a gold standard. Comparing to a gold standard would be calibration. So if two indirect instruments are compared, neither can be assumed to be the best. Both exhibit variability, and it is highly unlikely the methods will agree. The outcome is a clinical need or expectation, not a statistical one. So the question is the difference between the two methods likely to change clinical management? And the magnitude of acceptable variation is a matter of clinical judgment, and the authors do stress this, that should ideally be defined in advance. So you don't do the statistical technique and find out your 95% confidence levels of agreement and then say, yes, this proves this, that, or the other, or it proves that we've got to keep using GAT or whatever it might be. That's not the point. You've got to say up front what you're prepared to accept as a clinician, not as a statistician or a paper writer, but as a clinician. What are you prepared to accept in the assumption that it will not change your clinical management? Now, if you do come up with a revolutionary new machine, then you need to really compare it to a much more robust, true gold standard. So if you just want to introduce a new machine and get it into the market quickly, then yes, compare to the reference standard, which currently is Goldman. But if you come up with a new machine that utterly questions the GAT premise, then you don't want to be comparing it to GAT, you want to be comparing it to Tonometry. And that's a calibration process, not an agreement process. So let's assume that we're non-biased assessors. We come from a different background, perhaps biomechanics. We're given these two tonometers. We have no clue which is the better one. We just want to know that can one replace the other. So we have to sit down and decide, first of all, what would be our acceptable clinical difference before we set up the experiment. So I thought to myself, we take the 2009 paradigm or algorithm for prophylactic treatment of ocular hypertension. Now I know they've changed the baselines now from 21, but you know. So if we've got a patient with ocular hypertension and a CCT of 600 and a recorded IOP of 31 millimeters of mercury, the algorithm there states that no treatment is required. But if the same patient with an IOP of 33 millimeters would suggest that we prophylactically treat. So we could argue quite soundly, I think, that a variation of 2 millimeters of mercury could alter management. So is that a realistic goal? And what is the variability in the pachymetry measures as well, incidentally? You know, it's not just the IOP, but how accurate is the pachymetry? That's a whole other area. So the Bland and Altman technique actually can give you two things. It gives you correlation of repeatability, which is where we take one instrument and we compare it to itself. So repeat measures, whether it's in the same day or over a period of time, whatever, we repeat the measures to see how well it agrees with itself. And technically you need to do that before you do the next bit, which is limits of agreement, where you compare one machine to another. Because if you don't know the variability and the repeatability of each machine, it's very difficult to interpret the limits of agreement between the two machines. So let's compare, for this exercise, GAT with a particular NCT, the ocular response analyzer. So when we repeat GAT, we get a spread. We get a bias of minus 0.11. That's kind of insignificant anyway, isn't it? It agrees with itself. But what's important is the correlation of repeatability is pretty much plus or minus 5 millimeters of mercury. And the repeatability, the correlation of repeatability of the aura is, quite frankly, equally bad. It's again pretty much plus or minus 5. You'd kind of think perhaps because it was an objective machine it might be better, but it's still pretty wild. So you've got a lot of variability within the machines themselves before you go on and compare one machine to another. So when you do the comparison one to the other, which again is incorporated the variability of both machines, they do actually agree. The bias is only 0.3 millimeters of mercury, so you know they pretty much agree. But the range is again plus or minus 5 millimeters of mercury. So when we do the Wilcoxon signed rank test and the null hypothesis, it says we do accept the null hypothesis. Those two machines do agree with each other, and they're only 0.3 millimeters away in the bias. But it's the range, the variability in the system, that's really the problem. And that's a really difficult one to try to control. And ISO 8612 for tonometers does make this point, actually. They actually, first of all, they say in there, incidentally, the trouble with ISO 8612 is that you've got to buy it. You can't just look it up. And so a lot of researchers don't bother looking it up. They just reference other references. And they say ISO 8612 says you must compare to GAT. And it doesn't actually say that. It says the true intraocular pressure is seldom directly measured since it would require invasion of the eye. Since a true IRP cannot be clinically measured, alternative methods are specified for determining a reference. So again, this is simply saying, can one machine replace another machine? And they use the same sort of thing, but they are quite specific. They say to pass this, you have to have 120 eyes. You have to measure 40 between 7 and 16 millimeters mercury, 40 between 16 and 23, and 40 above 23. So all these other papers that come out ad hoc later, they're not following any ISO 8612 protocols. And if you're going to compare two machines, one could argue you should at least use an acceptable protocol. So all these other papers, you could question their validity anyway, because they're all using different strategies, different techniques, and they're claiming certain things. At least ISO 8612 say you have to do this, but look at it. The tolerance is plus or minus 5. So they'll allow a tolerance of plus or minus 5 millimeters of mercury for an instrument to be accepted. And that's okay, because we know you couldn't expect better because the variability in the machines is that bad. But every machine that hits the marketplace, it has to be assumed it has passed this test or it wouldn't be allowed to be marketed. So why we continue to keep comparing machines to machines when we know they've gone through quite a stringent technique already? And if you are going to question it, if you're going to question NICE itself, then fine. But don't just do ad hoc ones. You've got to actually physically do it the way they do it and see if you come up with the same result. So this is the sort of information that's presented in papers under very much idealized situations. And well, they actually say that under ideal circumstances of measuring the precision figures for GAT, they say that intra-observer variability, that's two readings by the same observer, will be within 2.5 millimeters of mercury with 95% confidence, which doesn't seem too bad. Inter-observer variability could be 4 millimeters of mercury. There are two papers that have come up with that. Thorburn and Cass, though, reported 5 millimeters, plus or minus 5 millimeters. And as I say there, in clinical practice, they're not ideal conditions, and these figures may be considerably higher. And that's actually true. You've got to think that. These papers are done where one person is, well, let's bring this up. We know for a start that the correlation of repeatability of GAT itself is plus or minus 5 millimeters. So that's the measurements we've come up with. So it correlates more with the sort of Thorburn and Cass type stuff. But also this one here, does this reflect accuracy or repeatability? Actually, I should say, sorry. Or is it simply the clinician's repeatability of their own technique, because they're comparing themselves to themselves? And even if they're wrong, even if they're making the wrong reading, if they repeat their own technique, they'll probably show quite good repeatability. So even the figure has to be critically appraised before you think about how you're going to interpret it. We already all know that there's a huge number of things that do cause variability in all tonometry measurements. You know, some are objective, some are subjective. You know, instrument techniques, physiological variability, circadian rhythms induce spikes. Whitaker and Steen suggest a CCT can induce a 9.9 millimeter of mercury span in GAT for the same intracameral IOP. There's mechanical friction. One of the great things about GAT was the fact that it reduced machine variables from 20 in the Shiots down to 3. So that was a great thing. But then what about solid state stuff now? Surely we can reduce that even further. Obviously IOP is more variable in glaucomatous patients anyway. Then there's biomechanical variability, rigidity, stiffness, shape, which I'll come on to. Let's stick to shape for a minute. Artificially thin corneas with LASIK. But shape, you know, you're ablating the cornea. And, you know, the clue's in the name. It's applanation tonometry. That is to say, we're making a plane surface. So if you've already ablated the cornea, the flattened shape must change the reading. You know, theoretically, if you had a completely plane surface, GAT would record a reading without actually applying any force at all. Certainly tears with GAT are a huge area of error. There's CCT, thick and thin, scarred, soft, distorted. And I'll come on to that ad nauseum later. And then there's certainly inter and intra-observer variability. So there's a whole range of things that can cause this variability. And, you know, the ideal tonometer has to try to control or eliminate all of those things. So the question people pose always is, are all NCTs bad? Or they might not phrase it like that. They might say, all NCTs are bad. And certainly NCTs have a poor reputation with ophthalmologists dealing with false positive referrals. And it must be frustrating. But is it the fault of the NCT? Or is it perhaps the fault of how some optometrists responded to the 2009 NICE guidelines? If you look on the left-hand side here, this is a thing I did. And again, I stress the point, I wasn't making any assumptions as to what tonometer was better. I was simply comparing them all to each other, rather than just saying, you know, GAT to Aura or Aura to GAT or whatever it might be. I compared them all to each other and saw how much they biased and so on. And now the NCT, the only one we did there, the Aura, actually agrees with GAT. There was no statistical difference between the readings of Aura and the readings of GAT. So they agree. And this was a lot of patients. This was, you know, 150 odd patients or something that we compared with. So they agree. So why, and okay, that's one bit of evidence. You could get another one that doesn't. So, but why the bad rep, really? I mean, could it be the fact that did all optometrists repeat the NCT? or simply back in 2009 anyway, state NICE said pressures 21, refer. Did they? I mean, we always repeat GAT. We're always told now to repeat GAT. So did these optometrists repeat NCT before referral? Is the variability simply within the repeatability of GAT and NCT? Did the optometrist read it within a zone of variability, and by the time it hit the ophthalmology department, they recorded in a different zone of the variability of GAT and NCT? And certainly was NCT used as a single referral criteria in the absence of other signs? And as we'll see in the next lecture, NICE specifically say you must never refer based on one NCT reading. Well, they wouldn't have put that in if some optometrists weren't exactly doing that. And of course, who makes the final decision on correctness? Well, it's the ophthalmology department. So it could be a sample bias. And in fact, Henson and Harper wrote a cracking paper back in 1998 on this, do non-contact tonometers read high? And they basically gave very good evidence that it's a biased sampling process that could be questioned. So, here we look at the general variability of GAT versus ORA. And although they agree, there's certainly a lot of variability in there. And you think, well, did the optometry department, when they referred, measured in one part of that variability zone, while the ophthalmology department measured in another part? You just don't know. And then the other point, NCTs are more susceptible to the effects of CCT. And are they? They're GAT mimics. Let's have a look at it. So this is the question I'm putting. So what the hell is CCT, modulus of elasticity, and hysteresis all about? Is it a help or is it a hindrance? So these two, I don't know if you know these things, the term hysteresis has come into our vocabulary since the aura was developed. And it's bandied around. So this particular author says, it's recognized a number of corneal parameters can affect the accurate measurement of IOP and also may be independent risk factors for glaucoma progression. So how thick is it? Central corneal thickness, CCT. Thicker corneas measure artificially high, thinner artificially low. How stretchy is it? And they're saying that's the modulus of elasticity. And how springy is it? And that's corneal hysteresis. Now they also say, look, I'll come back to those things in a minute. They also say CCT may be an independent risk factor. So yes, because the cornea is attached to the sclera, which is attached to the lamina cribosa, and since we know that the lamina cribosa is the site of damage, then yeah, for sure, a thinner CCT could actually be a direct link, mechanical link to the lamina cribosa. So it could be an independent factor. But that's not part of today's lecture. Today's about the accuracy of GAT in this case. So let's have a look at this. How stretchy is it? Modulus of elasticity in biomechanical terms is a measure of a material's stiffness, not stretchiness. And this is again vocabulary. You've got to use the right vocabulary. It's too easy to shove this stuff in and it sounds good. Corneal hysteresis, how springy is it? Well, hysteresis technically is simply one part of a tissue's viscoelasticity. And because this is the sort of stuff that is bandied around, I feel it's important to take time to explain how this really works. It's convoluted, it's long, I'm sorry. So most tonometers have to contend with biomechanical resistance of the cornea. So they've got to push that cornea in so far. Now I say most because there is one is based on a theoretical principle that's quite robust actually. But what are the corneal biomechanical profiles that we have to consider? Whitford, they consider corneal biomechanics as an expression of geometry So we think of biomechanics as just a cellular type thing, but it's thickness and topography, so and material stiffness. And material stiffness is contingent on the corneal microstructure. So while we can measure topography and CCT in vivo, corneal microstructure we can't do. We would have to excise the cornea to measure the stiffness. So that's why CCT is almost by default, well, it is the only thing that we can really measure. Well, theoretically. So as we already said, we can't measure corneal tissue stiffness without excising strips and stressing. So if we were really to look at the biomechanics of the cornea, we'd have to be looking at that, which we can't. So the primary measure of microstructure is this thing called Young's modulus, which is also called modulus of elasticity. They're the same thing. And the elastic modulus is the ratio of pressure applied to the change in length induced. So it's a measure of the intrinsic stiffness of a material, and that is not synonymous with rigidity. And this is where a lot of the literature gets way confused, because they're being written by optometrists and ophthalmologists, not by people who understand biomechanics particularly well. And they just, and you know, if you say something's rigid or stiff, it sounds like the same sort of thing. Well, they're not. Biomechanically, they're not. So elasticity reflects a material's capacity to sustain stress without permanent deformation. And when the stress is removed, the material will return to its habitual dimensions. So the loading-unloading curve is a straight line. And the mechanical stress energy is stored reversibly, allowing the material to revert to its original dimensions on removal of the stress, without loss of any energy as heat. So that's the modulus of elasticity, or Young's modulus. So CCT should really be considered simply a surrogate measure of corneal biomechanics, but it's certainly not perfect. So while CCT is very important because it is the only in vivo measurable reflection of corneal biomechanics, there is something else coming up that people claim is another measure, which I dispute. But CCT must not be assumed an absolute. No correction algorithm has been validated, says Brandt, and proposed corrections range from 2 to 7 millimeters of mercury per 100 microns of corneal thickness. And Brandt even showed that the assumption of linear correlations could lead to a negative value of IOP in specific cases when you do the correction. So, and this was the whole drive in the early 21st century, was to come up with this nice algorithm where we could correct GAT readings for the variability that CCT created. But it turned out that it didn't really work. And Liu and Roberts have a simple metaphor for this. They say, you know, you might have a steel rod and a wooden rod, and they might be both the same thickness, but the wood rod will be more easily deformed than the steel rod. So it's the microstructure of the actual thing that we're measuring that really plays a role, not the actual thickness, but the thickness reflects it to some extent. So for instance, if a cornea is mega thick but edematous, it will not be as stiff, i.e. it would have a lower Young's modulus. But if a cornea is very, very thin but scarred, it could actually be stiffer. So again, the microstructure is important. Now, another couple of points. The modulus of rigidity is shear modulus. So if you use the term shear modulus, it's more descriptive than saying modulus of rigidity, but they're the same thing. And this represents the elastic modulus in shear. So it is a different thing to Young's or elastic modulus. So as such, the forces are applied in a material in opposite directions in different planes of material. And this does happen with GAT and all GAT mimics. They are causing shear forces as they bend the cornea around the zone of bend. And that also introduces these things called boundary conditions, which are zones of stress at interfaces. And they're extremely important with GAT and GAT mimics, specifically GAT and GAT mimics. So during applanation, the pressure profile in the peripheral cornea, notwithstanding the additional external loads, will be actually different to the profile under the tonometer probe. And indeed, the zone of flexure between those two zones is a boundary condition. And there's certain forces going on in there that no GAT models ever really considered. And then we introduce this thing called hysteresis. So viscoelasticity, which we all know about, comprises three things actually: creep, relaxation, and hysteresis. Now, hysteresis describes the different stress-strain response during cyclical loading and unloading of a biological tissue. Okay, the constitutive equations are different for each phase. And loading and unloading, unlike the elastic material that you see there, are not straight lines. So Young and Bodanis, they describe it in a mechanical terms. Hysteresis is a result of dissipation of energy as heat during a stress cycle. So it's not quite the same, but it still has to do with the microstructure. So this is where this Aura machine came in. These two, Luce and Taylor, found, Luce in particular, I think, the inward, so you're doing applanation with an air puff tonometer. So you're increasing the air pressure to applanate the cornea. And the inward traditional measure is taken as the air puff increases and the convex cornea is flattened to a plane surface. And that's P1. Then the aura shuts off, this is all tonometers, all NCTs, shuts off after P1 is reached, but there is certain level of inertia in the system and the pressure continues to increase before reaching a peak. So at this point, the cornea is concave. Now the pressure then, or at least the cornea, then starts decreasing again as it returns to its habitual shape. So the forces within the cornea and the IOP, then obviously when the pressure is finally released and it's shut off, the cornea then starts to revert and it goes back to its, through a plane surface, back to a convex surface. And when it hits its second plane point, again, it's no different to the machine. It knows it's a plane surface, so the polarized light gets caught again and it takes a second reading. But the second reading doesn't read a pressure that's the same as the first reading. And the authors dubbed this lag between P1 and P2 as corneal hysteresis, suggesting it is created by the viscous dampening of the cornea and qualifies biomechanical properties of the cornea. So they have taken an observation of a machine and created a biomechanical, what I would call a quasi-biomechanical concept to be associated with it. And then they're putting importance on that reading as a measure of corneal biomechanics. Something which I have to say I question. So Dupps back into that reports Luce as defining corneal hysteresis more conservatively. So they had this great claim about it really is a measure of corneal biomechanics. But originally, Luce defined it as conservative, as the output of the aura under specific measurement conditions imposed by the aura. Because if you think about it, the cornea has gone through its plane surface where the first measure is taken, then it proceeds into a concave configuration before when the pressure plume is cut off, and then all the pressures in the eye and the cornea start forcing it back into a habitual shape where it simply takes another measure. making the assumption that that is a reflection just of corneal hysteresis is, in my opinion, a little bit of a leap. But certainly the cautionary interpretation of the new metric Luce and Taylor suggest reflects the limited understanding. This was back when they first came up with it, though, back in 2006. The limited understanding of what the waveforms actually represent. So they didn't understand it, they observed it and then decided that they could interpret in a certain way. And I do think the interpretation is up to a certain level of debate. These other authors modelling the return applanation conclude the corneal response is influenced not only by corneal biomechanics, but by the IOP pushing backwards, the CCT, the curvature, and it's bound to be, in my opinion. So the idea, though, I've had emails with these characters. The idea was to adjust gap equivalent reading. So they had an aura IOP-G, which was their equivalent reading of a GAT reading, as a standard NCT would be. But they wanted to compensate it for corneal biomechanics, hence the IOP-CC. So they did an algorithm where they adjusted the reading based on this second reading in a proprietary way. But since there's but when we did it, there's no statistical difference between the points anyway. So you can't improve on GAT and agree with GAT at the same time. And they were striving to agree with GAT. They did not want it to disagree with GAT because they feel that GAT's the thing they've got to compare to. So if you're going to have an improvement on GAT, one could argue it should differ from GAT. Well, it doesn't. So if by compensating for biomechanical errors, the IOP measurement is improved, then the two measures should really not agree. And if they do agree, then there's frankly no point spending like £6,000 or £7,000 or £8,000 on a machine that doesn't differ from GAT. That's my opinion. Luce and Taylor will have a different argument. And the other thing is pachymetry and repeatability. We're told to repeat everything. We have to repeat GAT, we have to repeat NCT readings, we have to repeat fields before we refer. We're told to repeat everything, and yet we take a single pachymetry reading. And this particular set of authors did report on this. They said a standard practice is to take a single pachymetry reading, but they did readings and they found that there was a huge range, and I did it as well. I did repeatability of an ultrasound pachymeter, and the range was plus or minus like 18 microns. So it was huge. And I do think that really the best pachymeters would be things like OCT that do it optically. I think they're far more accurate. So, there we are. We're trying to correct for this pachymetry. We're trying to correct for CCT. And yes, there's variability in it, but then there's variability in the way we measure it as well. So it's yet another layer of confusion to the whole CCT and IOP measurement techniques that we have available to us at the moment. So there are other tonometers around. And these two, the Tonopen and the DCT, do have real importance in my opinion. The Tonopen came out around about the same time as GAT, but it was designed by people with a background in biomedical engineering and mathematics, not optometrists. And it's a really clever design. The Tonopen is difficult to use though, and I think there's a load of error in it for other reasons. But basically its footprint is about the same as GAT. But the sensor that actually measures pressure is only about 1 millimeter in the middle. So all the bending and shearing forces and tear forces are neutralized by the non-sensitive base plate. So the tears are squeezed out, the stress forces on the bend are way away, and then it's only this central 1 millimeter sensor that records pressure, I have to say, rather than force. And the DCT is simply a 21st century upgrade on this, really. And once shell stress is neutralized by the DCT, casing, the Newton's third law holds, and only intraocular pressure is transmitted to the sensor. And the DCT also, again, back to what we said about an upgrade on technology, its precision's enhanced due to gathering 100 IOP readings per second over 5 to 8 seconds. So, you know, if there's an upgrade on GAT, you'd have to say this is a little baby. And importantly, DCT is not trying to be GAT. It's, you know, NCTs are trying to be GAT. Consequently, when they developed this thing, they didn't compare it to GAT, they calibrated against manometry. And they did not compare to the standard. And it does read higher, 2 to 3 millimeters higher than GAT. So there are other machines. There's the iCare, and it was a good design as well. Basically, its design mandate was really a research tool rather than a commercial tool, and they wanted to measure IOP in mice and rats when developing glaucomatous models. And it records the deceleration and rebound movement of a probe as it contacts the eye. So it's different, and I think its reason for development is phenomenal. Then there's this thing that we've already said about triggerfish, and it's based on another biomechanical concept, nothing like GAT. Intraocular fluid, you've got to appreciate, is incompressible. So any rise in IOP has to cause the shell to expand. The biomechanical expectation that corneal curvature will vary in response to intracameral IOP is real and has been incorporated into this. So it has a microfabricated platinum titanium strain gauge. So the DCT uses Pascal's law of hydrostatic pressure. This uses an equally valid concept of the shell changes. So it quantifies variation in corneal curvature induced by the intracameral IOP. It's very, very subtle though, and it does not record IOP at all. Its output is in millivolts, and the readout cannot be equated to specific measures of pressure in either pascals or millimeters of mercury. Now, the one being developed by Professor El Sheikh is trying to give a readout that means something to us, because if we got this load of OK over a 24-hour period, what are we going to do with it? Again, it's that avalanche of data that we're not going to be able to necessarily comprehend immediately. But it's a brilliant idea. So there you have it. An absolutely not black and white review of tonometry and pagyometry. You know, it's much easier clinically if we just believe that GAT's the best. It makes our lives far easier. But I don't believe the debate is closed on that. I don't believe GAT is the gold standard. It's certainly the reference standard, but it's certainly not the gold standard. And you know, historically, prior to this, SHIOTS was the standard. But almost immediately after it was introduced in 1905, flaws were found in it. And Professor SHIOTS in 1920 had to write a new paper with corrections for his conversion curves and for the instrument itself. And in fact, they even had a global committee appointed specifically to standardize the manufacture of SHIOTS. So I think we always think, though, that in 1955, when GAT came out, it immediately superseded everything prior, but it actually didn't work that way. It takes a long time to break habit, and familiarity with something is hard to break. And in fact, the SHIOTS instrument was still in relatively common use even into the 70s, partially because of its easy portability, which was a heck of an advantage, of course, over the GAT, which had to be attached to a slit lamp. So I think the debate's out there for a replacement for GAT. I mean, do we want something that doesn't take a pinpoint measurement during a day? Do we want to try to come up with something that does a broader reach for tonometry? It's all very interesting. So anyway, we'll leave there now, and we'll get on to the next section about other clinical things we need to deal with as IP optometrists and glaucoma.